Order, order. Can I welcome our witnesses to our committee hearing today? Well, this is part of our ongoing inquiry on the contractual arrangements that the Home Office has to provide asylum accommodation. So we're interested in the way the contracts work, how that works for both those who are clients and those who are affected more widely, including local authorities that we'll be speaking to and the next evidence session. And the committee has undertaken some work visiting some locations. We will be very careful not to say where we've been or to mention specific locations in order that we are looking at this in a general sense. I also want to welcome Will Forster, who is here guesting from the Housing and Local Government Committee. You're very welcome. Good to see you here. Perhaps if I can ask the witnesses to introduce themselves and then we'll move on to the questions. Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan Smith. I'm a solicitor from the law firm Deighton, Glynn, where we have a specialist public law and civil liberties practice.
Hello, I'm Alex Fraser. I'm the UK Director for Refugee Support and Restoring Family Links at the British Red Cross.
Hi, I'm Enver Solomon. I'm the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council. We're the largest single provider working with around about 15,000 people in the asylum and refugee system across England.
Thank you. Right, we will start our questions and we start with Jake Richards.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming in on a sunny afternoon. I just thought we'd start with a very broad question about your sort of central concerns as to the adequacy of accommodation for asylum seekers and the role of hotels, because we hear an awful lot about hotels in the media and elsewhere and what role they play in some of the problems and some of the solutions as well. I don't know if we start with Megan and maybe go down the line.
Yeah, sure. There are a number of challenges. I think for us, there are three central concerns. One is poor quality accommodation across the estate, including in hotels. The standards with which the Home Office and its contractors need to comply are relatively low, and I can get into the detail of that if that's helpful. But we continue to see across the estate those standards not being complied with. The second is the failure to protect particularly vulnerable asylum seekers. Examples of that would include small children, newborn babies who are in hotels for months, sometimes years. I've seen cases of 2 years in overcrowded rooms. The third is the failure to monitor the performance of contractors, which I know the committee is very much alive to. Many of the cases that we see could have been avoided if the contracts are being monitored properly, and that includes the performance of subcontractors that actually run the hotels. In relation to hotels, there are a real variety of issues that we see, both in terms of the quality, so we see disrepair issues, failure to provide adequate food, nutritious food, particularly for children, and we also see forced room sharing of survivors of torture and trafficking. I can go into detail on those if you wish, but maybe I'll let the other panellists give their overview.
Thank you. As I say, I'm here from the British Red Cross, an independent humanitarian organisation, part of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. And we support people, about 40,000 people a year, throughout the whole arc of the asylum journey. And over the last few years, we've seen what we call an exponential rise in the demand for the services that we provide. And a lot of those issues that we support people with, that our caseworkers support people with, are in relation to accommodation. I think just in the last 12 months, our casework team have completed something like 30,000 actions in relation to accommodation, just on accommodation. And it's always been very challenging, but I think certainly what we've seen the situation become more challenging is with the increased use of hotels and other large-scale sites over the last few years, often outside of community settings. That's where they tend to be located. And that's been further compounded by Operation Maximise a couple of years ago with the expansion of room sharing, particularly room sharing with strangers, and the change to the accommodation allocation policy last year. So all these factors have combined to make this a very challenging moment for anybody supporting people in the asylum system. I think, though, one thing that was really important for me today was to perhaps step back very slightly and remind ourselves who the people in the asylum system are. So we're talking about people who've experienced some of the most difficult, dangerous places in the world. They've experienced some of the worst trauma that any human being could experience. The people we support have experienced torture, sexual and gender-based violence, domestic abuse, trafficking, often separated from their loved ones, isolated, fearful, and not certain of what the future holds. And that's for us why this matters so much, and that's why we're here today and have submitted evidence to this committee. We're very grateful for the opportunity. And when we speak to people, generally what most people want is what any of us would want, to live in safety and dignity. And we find that's often difficult. And yes, we certainly have examples of good practice and people who respond to the concerns either raised by people living in the different forms of asylum accommodation or by our caseworkers, but often we don't find that. And we find that there's inadequate responses to the situations that people are living in, often inadequate because of material things like mould, infestation, leaks and so on, but more around the feeling of safety, particularly for people who have experienced sexual gender-based violence, survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, survivors of domestic abuse, people who have been trafficked, age-disputed children. Now, we're particularly concerned about those people and their experiences in the system. And we think that part of the reason why we carry out so many actions in relation to supporting those people, two things probably. First of all is the current process of initial screening and vulnerability assessment. So from day one, that needs to be improved, and I'm sure we'll come on to that later on. But also a lot of this, I think, is rooted in practice, experience, culture and trust. The reason why a lot of people will disclose to us later on in their asylum journey is because they have high levels of trust with us. The challenge we often find is when we're trying to get a response to whatever the issue is, whether we think someone's been moved into inadequate accommodation or because of some material issue with, say, a leaking roof, is that those people often aren't taken seriously. There's a culture of disbelief often that people tell us about. And so we often have to advocate and work quite hard to get responses. If we have a good long-standing relationship with housing officers and accommodation providers, that's often a much more effective process. But where we don't, where we're relying on email boxes and so on, often we get no response at all. So that's a bit of a brief sort of overview as we see things.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd endorse comments by both Alex and Megan. And look, I don't think the current system works in three ways, very briefly. It doesn't provide value money for the taxpayer. It doesn't work for local communities and councils. And as we've been hearing, it doesn't work for those in the system itself, people seeking asylum. So just in terms of value for money, I mean, the committee will be very aware of the cost. You know, we're talking about billions of pounds of public money here being wasted on a system which frankly is dysfunctional and highly inefficient. If you just look at the amount of money that goes from the contractors, for example, Clear Springs, to the middlemen that are then procuring accommodation, they're creaming off huge profits. And that has been exposed in media articles and in evidence that the committee will be aware of. It is a grossly inefficient system. The Office for Value for Money's work on temporary accommodation in its terms of reference that's being done by the Treasury that includes accommodation for asylum seekers, they recognise it. Government acknowledges that. Local authorities and local communities, the way the system is currently designed is that it allows a private contractor like Serco to move into an area and fundamentally distort and disrupt the local housing market. It's utterly dysfunctional in the way that it does that because it can purchase private accommodation on the private market and push up costs. It is disastrous consequences for the local housing market and very, very frustrating for local councils. It also, in the way that they then purchase accommodation, in particular poorer areas or poorer wards within council areas, creates huge resentment, fuels massive resentment, builds community tensions, and we saw the worst of that play out in the riots last summer. And then finally, for people seeking asylum, look, we've heard lots of evidence around that. I would just say one fundamental thing, which is around safeguarding. At the moment, the safeguarding risks, roles and responsibilities are still poorly misunderstood, woefully misunderstood by the providers, Clear Springs, Mears and Serco, and also not effectively understood and dispensed by the Home Office. And I think that fuels poor decision making when it comes to fundamental decisions about individuals who are facing serious safeguarding risks.
Very helpful. Maybe a follow-up question for Alex and Enver first. I mean, how widespread is the problems with accommodation? The committee are attending lots of different sites, and I think it's fair to say that the variety in the problems is pretty is pretty large. And then maybe for Megan, just in terms of particular groups and safeguarding issues, how easy or perhaps maybe how difficult is it for service users, residents, to challenge the system in which they find themselves in? Maybe start with Alex and then Enver and then Megan.
Yeah, no, thank you. So it's a very mixed picture. You know, I think we tend to find perhaps more concern in hotel accommodation than we do in the community-based accommodation. In fact, you know, our view is that accommodation should be rooted in communities for a range of reasons. So we find some of the issues that people face, particularly in hotels that are on the outskirts of towns, on the side of motorways and so on, can be quite problematic. I remember just fairly recently sitting in one of our drop-ins. I won't give the location, but just in the space of a couple of hours, I met a range of people who had come into our drop-in who were living in one of those hotels. I met a group of Syrians who came to get support from our team. Now, they'd been living in this hotel for something like 2 months, but they hadn't really realised a whole range of really important things about what was happening next, where they could get support from, and how they could raise concerns if they had them. And the reason I mention that is because one of the people amongst this group of Syrians was actually a 17-year-old child. And they were sort of taking this young person under their wing, but at no point up to that point had anyone done anything else about it. Of course, we then took appropriate action and so on. But it just gives an example of how sometimes those hotel settings, they are kind of out of sight. And I suppose that would be more of a concern for us, and also more difficult for organisations to have a presence there who can go in and see what's going on and help people. But I think a bit like at the start of the asylum journey, there needs to be a much more robust initial screening and vulnerability assessment. There also needs to be a much better, clearer, transparent process of inspection and monitoring of all locations. Not just one or two, but all locations. Given those vulnerabilities that I spoke about earlier, that people in this room will be aware of, it's critical that there is that oversight and accountability. When I met with some of our caseworkers last team, I spoke to them about this, and they said it's almost like the accountability fizzles out when it gets down to that last mile. It's not clear kind of how that accountability works.
You said that last what? Sorry.
The last mile. So often at a local level, you sort of can get two versions. You can often have a really great relationship and really good localised action, or you can get the opposite of that. But the question is, you know, where's the accountability, where's the scrutiny, where's the monitoring, which will drive up performance, because it's possible. I mean, as I say, we do see examples of where accommodation settings are run well, and we'll notify someone of a concern, and they'll get a welfare officer to go out and do an assessment. But we don't always get that. And I suppose that's the question. How do you ensure a much higher level of consistency in practice, not just great guidance and policy, but it has to be demonstrated in practice and has to be monitored and assessed?
Yeah, I mean, I would endorse that. Look, there's huge variability. I mean, I particularly draw your attention to HMOs, which are used by, you know, the private contractors, poor quality accommodation that they know they can use for the purposes of the contracts that landlords are struggling to rent. You know, this is a gift to Rachmanite landlords, in effect. I would also say that, you know, the lack of inspection and oversight is a real issue here, and the lack of resource capability of the Home Office to exercise that. And I'd just draw one critical comparison here. The CQC was appointed by the Home Office to inspect accommodation provided to survivors of modern slavery who are supported under the Modern Slavery Victim Care Contract. There isn't the equivalent for asylum accommodation contracts, and there really should be, because, you know, you do get some really poor quality accommodation that is impacting on individuals' mental health, well-being and physical health. And just finally, I would say, don't forget the plight of unaccompanied children, some of whom are older teenagers, and they're often put into what is called supported accommodation, but effectively they're having to fend for themselves without adequate support. And we know that that is an issue for British teenagers in the care system, but it is doubly challenging if you've come here as an unaccompanied child.
In response to your question about how easy or difficult it is for individuals to challenge, exceptionally difficult in our experience, particularly if individuals don't have support from frontline organisations, which are exceptionally stretched on the ground, or legal aid solicitors, which are also, unfortunately, quite few and far between in the current landscape. I think there are various issues. One is a lack of information and communication. So most of our clients do not know how they should raise issues. They often don't know that they should contact migrant help or whether they should go to hotel staff. And then there's also a lack of communication around who to go to with what issues. So, there's a real range of issues, as we've heard: safeguarding, disrepair, inadequate accommodation generally, like room sharing. It's really unclear to our clients who to go to for what. And also there's often a kind of circular communication. So take safeguarding, for example. A client we have supported facing racial harassment, motivated harassment, would go to migrant help. Migrant help would say, we can't help, go to your accommodation provider. Go to the kind of safeguarding mechanism at the accommodation provider. You need to go to your housing officer. You need to speak to the Home Office. And so this takes weeks and months sometimes of people in really seriously inadequate accommodation that is having a detrimental impact on their mental and physical health. When we get involved at the litigation stage, all of our clients, either themselves but mostly with frontline organisations, have contacted migrant help, hotel staff, accommodation provider, and sometimes the Home Office through escalation routes. But nothing is done until we send a pre-action letter or perhaps even start judicial review proceedings. And we have acted for hundreds of asylum seekers in this situation over the past year alone. And in the vast majority of cases, the issues are resolved following a pre-action letter or litigation or a court order.
They are resolved?
They are resolved, yeah. A very few cases go to a full hearing.
Are you legal aid funded for them?
Yeah, exactly. And so that to us is not an effective system, and it's certainly not an effective use of public funds, particularly when huge sums are already being spent on the accommodation system. And I'd like to stress, we are only able to assist a proportion of asylum seekers, and so it would not, I imagine there are huge numbers of individuals who are just stuck in inadequate accommodation, and that is worsened by the fact there's inadequate monitoring. So, there's no visibility of them and no way for them to access the adequate accommodation that they're entitled to.
Thank you.
Robbie Moore.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to drill down a little bit more on the detail of the way in which some of the accommodation providers are delivering on the requirements within their contracts, or as they said, or as they may have indicated they should be delivering on them. So maybe if I just ask this question to all of you, but it would be great to get your answers. Do you feel that accommodation, in written evidence that we've received, accommodation providers have been telling us that they have been going above and beyond in terms of meeting their requirements? Is that your experience?
So we work with accommodation providers in different parts of the country, and look, I think it's very variable. For example, in some of the hotels in one region, without identifying a particular region, the provider has individuals in that hotel that are effectively the welfare manager for, sometimes hundreds of people, dozens and dozens of individuals in that hotel. Some welfare managers will go above and beyond. Indeed, we have some staff at the Refugee Council who have worked as welfare managers who then got jobs with us. Others won't, and others will literally sit there and see it as their job to push back and not go the extra mile. And, as we've heard, trying to get additional support from migrant help, especially due to the lack of face-to-face casework support, because its telephone helpline is extremely difficult. So I don't think they are consistently going above and beyond. I think there are some very hard-working individuals in the system that seek to do that, but in our experience, that is not the consistent practice.
And maybe can I just expand on that, and then I'll come across to you, Alex, as well. But do you know what the expectation is of an accommodation provider to provide? What are they, in terms of the reference to us as a committee is some have been going above and beyond, but above and beyond is a what? Is it that...
Yeah, so they're not there to provide casework support. They're very clear. They're basic accommodation providers, to make sure that the accommodation is essentially safe. They're not there to take on additional detailed casework advice and support. That's not their role. Some will help. If I'm an individual, I go to the welfare manager, I don't understand a letter that's come from the Home Office. Some welfare managers will seek to advise, or they'll refer to Refugee Council staff that might be working in the accommodation. There's also a big issue, and this was identified by the Inspectorate, the Borders Inspectorate, about the safeguarding requirements in the contract, which I don't think are clear enough, and I don't think set out the right requirements around safeguarding. And then there's issues around, accountability in relation to contract compliance too. But I'll pass over to Alex.
Thank you. Our experience would be very similar to what Enver's just set out. It really is a very varied, mixed picture. And we have examples of stuff that you just can't quite believe is happening. And you have examples of other stuff where you're like, wow, that's brilliant, But you shouldn't have a system with those two extremes in it, And it's how... I think a lot of this goes back to the inspection regime, the monitoring, and perhaps, maybe looking at what those minimum standards are. Because, of course, minimum standards should be being met, but maybe those minimum standards needs to be raised. Maybe the bar needs to be raised up. But we do see such a mixed picture. And I think sometimes, I know it's very demoralising, actually, for those people who are putting their heart and soul and time into improving situations, going above and beyond, when not everyone is doing that. Because often the voice that you will hear about is where things are bad, and rightly so, because that's what you need to drive up and improve. That's where we have our major worries and concerns. That is where we'll focus, But we see. To give an example of where we saw someone really going above and beyond, and I'm sure we'll come on to speak a little bit more about age-disputed children. But there was an example of one accommodation provider where someone working there really took it upon themselves to work with the voluntary sector, work with statutory organisations, work with the local authority to provide a much more age-appropriate space within a particular hotel. And that was real initiative, and I'm sure that's made a big difference to those people. The question is, why can't we replicate that? That should be the norm, not the exception. So it's how you replicate and reward, perhaps, those sort of things that go well above and beyond, But our experience is varied. And, as you saw in our written submission, we have lots of examples of stuff that, frankly, beggars belief in terms of, the experience. I can talk about some of those here just now, if helpful again, but it's written in our evidence, of course.
That's kind, thank you. And Megan?
Yeah, so just to add that example of identifying a vulnerable individual, assessing what they need, and then referring to relevant statutory and voluntary agencies is actually what the providers are meant to be doing under the accommodation contract. They have an obligation to identify individuals who have specific needs and who are at risk, and they're defined in the contract. I think a significant concern we have, and I know other NGOs that we work with do, is that the hotel staff on the ground do not have the sufficient training or experience to be able to do that. Sometimes it seems that the Home Office are expecting hotel staff to be able to identify an individual who is at risk of modern slavery. But we know from the cases that we've seen, so in the context of forced room sharing, for example, if an individual has a positive reasonable grounds decision through the NRM, so there are reasonable grounds to conclude that they are a victim of trafficking, they should be automatically excluded from room sharing. But in our cases, individuals have presented their reasonable grounds decision, exposing themselves as a vulnerable person to hotel staff who they do not know, and then been told, oh, sorry, you need a GP letter. And that is not a criticism of the individual hotel staff, it's just a criticism of the system and the lack of adequate training and safeguarding in place in hotels.
So you've all three of you have highlighted maybe the variances that exist, whether it be geographically or varying between different accommodation providers. And almost there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy, certainly from the evidence that's come to the committee and our own experiences for the visits that we've seen, is a variation on what the expectations are from that accommodation provider, whether it's housing or indeed what additional support should they provide over and above. In terms of looking at contract renewal, what would your recommendations be in terms of should it change, or should there be more emphasis put on those accommodation providers to provide that additional support?
Well, look, we would argue that private contractors are not the right contractors to be providing accommodation, care and support to a very vulnerable group of individuals. Local authorities are already doing it for a whole range of different groups, including victims of domestic violence, prison leavers, families who are in priority need homelessness, and a much more effective system would be to join up provision of accommodation and support to achieve economies of scale and to avoid the situation at the moment where Whitehall is effectively competing with itself for access to housing and support associated to that housing for a number of different vulnerable groups. So I just don't think the contracts are fit for purpose. I don't think they deliver value for money, and I don't think the most effective way to meet the accommodation or support needs of this group.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I think when we look to the future, so there's several things that seem really important to me and to our organisation. So one, which is often absent, is how you include the voice of the people who are living in the system in the onward design of it. That would help a great deal, I think, in terms of both what good would look like in terms of safe, dignified accommodation that delivers what people need and care about whilst they're in the system. I think also it's thinking about whoever's delivering the contract, because someone has to deliver it. There has to be, as we've already said, a much more clear and transparent and rigorous inspection regime, whoever's delivering it, to agreed standards that are transparent, so everyone understands what's expected. And when it's falling short, action is taken. That's critical as well. And then also, I think, some of the things that I spoke about right at the start, which have happened, which I think has compounded the issues, we need to see some of those things change as well. And I suppose that's that link between policy and whoever's delivering the contract. So things like Operation Maximise, the use of, people sharing rooms with strangers, particularly where they've got recognised vulnerabilities, and also around the use of large-scale sites. I mean, our belief is that accommodation should be rooted as far as possible within communities.
Thank you. And Megan, any additional points that you wanted to?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I think the suggestion, moving it into more local authority accommodation, we would be supportive of that given all of the issues that we've seen with the delivery of accommodation to date. I think it's just really important to emphasise that isn't a magic solution that would make a lot of these problems go away. A lot of the problems are also within the Home Office. So failure to adequately assess vulnerabilities and needs, failure to pass that information on to whoever is providing the accommodation, and then failure to monitor. That would all still need to happen, given that it is the Secretary of State's duty under legislation to ensure that she is providing adequate accommodation in every individual case.
Thank you.
I'll just follow up on the Enver, Megan point about this local authority. I mean, forgive me if this is a silly question, but I mean, we get casework all the time, and at the moment, local authority are unable to house people leaving prison, children in care, child leavers. How would that work?
Yeah, so this is where I think the Office for Value for Money's review on how you can provide sustainable funding for temporary accommodation for a range of groups, including the ones, people in the asylum system, the ones you've just identified, is so critical. There needs to be a long-term strategy to create a capital fund at the centre of government that provides resource to local authorities to provide housing and support to these vulnerable groups. Prison leavers, people in the asylum system, victims of domestic violence, and also families that are in priority need facing homelessness. And if you create a single capital fund that can provide accommodation for these groups, that is funded by central government, and there's different funding mechanisms without going into the detail there that I believe the Treasury is looking at, that would be within the fiscal rules set by the Chancellor, there is a real opportunity to create a once-in-a-generation opportunity to shift the dial on how you provide accommodation and support for multiple vulnerable groups at the local level with sustainable funding in place. That is the only way that I think we're really going to get the step change that is required and delivers economies of scale that should be within the purview of local areas to deliver to meet the needs of vulnerable groups. At the moment, Whitehall is competing against itself to access housing and support for these different vulnerable groups. And that, if you think about it, is a ludicrous waste of public funds.
Can I just ask you, you've touched on suitable accommodation, we've had evidence on this. Large sites, are they ever suitable?
So, it depends what you mean by a large site. I think what a lot of people don't perhaps think about is that the hotels in themselves are large sites. So you can have 200-300 people living in a large site. There's a lot less scrutiny of those locations. I'm not sure how many hotels are open at the moment, but it's a lot. And so you tend to get a lot more people talking about sites like Wethersfield or Napier or in the past Pen Alley, you know. I think there are examples where you can have sites that are used for a very short period to support good initial arrival. We've seen that in Syrian resettlement, for example, but it's a very different model. It's a very different model. It should not be part of a permanent accommodation system because people spend months, if not sometimes, you know, years in the system. And so there are things that people get from being within a community that you just can't get from a large-scale site that's out of touch with the community. Because, of course, you want everywhere to be safe. You want to have certain standards in place. That should be a given, whatever the type of accommodation. What you can't easily replicate are the other things that people tell us they really value from being in community-based accommodation. And from a sort of human perspective, there are things that we would all recognise are important for us to feel human and to be well, to be able to participate in local communities. And if you're in a large-scale site cut off from society, essentially, or at least from communities in the way that you are when you're living in a community, at some point you will leave that large-scale site. And I think that makes that onward pathway, whatever that is, more difficult for everybody involved. And I think surely it's better to have people learning new skills, learning English, contributing through volunteering, as people so often do. I look at my own team of volunteers. You know, we've got an incredible team, about 1,000 volunteers who work in my team. About half of those people have been in the asylum system or have been displaced. You know, people want to contribute and participate. That can help actually with some of the issues that otherwise people experience when they are in an isolated room miles from everywhere, whether that's in a large-scale site like Wethersfield or somewhere like a hotel on the side of the A1, you know.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's instructive to look at how we managed support and accommodation for Afghans when they arrived. We didn't put them in large former military sites for weeks and months on end. We rapidly moved them into community accommodation. And remember, the majority, you know, at least 6 out of 10 people that come through the asylum system will be supported to go on and rebuild their lives of refugees in our communities. There's certain nationalities, for example, are Afghans, where you could be supporting with that process, that move on, that integration from day one. Large sites don't facilitate that. And I think the risk with large sites is the location is often very isolated. The quality of the provision is often very poor, the infrastructure around it, and it's very difficult to put in good quality casework and legal support to people in large sites as well.
Do you want to add anything?
Just a couple of things on lessons to be learned in relation to kind of large sites. I read in the Home Office's evidence that proposing a site in a town in the north, I think it's a former student halls, which is part, I think, of the government's considerations, that and disused care homes. I think that raises, or if the Home Office is going to go through with that, it needs to reflect on lessons learned, particularly from Wethersfield. We've seen from large sites that, you know, a huge number of individuals with complex mental health problems and trauma that go untreated for extended periods of time, unable to work and engage the local community, creates really significant problems, and in the long run increases their dependency and need for local services because their health really rapidly deteriorates in our experience. I think one thing I just really wanted to quickly touch on is we've seen in what they refer to as large sites, so barracks and vessels, and on-site medical provision, which I think is, you know, seems like a fantastic idea, but the way that it's been delivered has been insufficient. both in terms of the quality of care that's provided and lack of monitoring by the Home Office, but also information sharing. So, if individual really vulnerable asylum seekers are presenting to an on-site medical provision and saying, I'm having suicidal thoughts, which is not an uncommon occurrence, unfortunately, there needs to be some sort of effective and data protecting information sharing in place that allows them to raise that with the Home Office and ensure that those really urgent needs are responded to effectively.
Moving on to allocation of accommodation, I'm conscious of time, so if we can keep the answers, perhaps if one person said your point, maybe not say it again, but let's move on to Margaret Mullane.
To Megan, this is a question really. So you've stated that the current system for allocating accommodation isn't working. You obviously, how often do you see asylum seekers moving across accommodation? And obviously we've discussed earlier what the impact is. And with that, against a backdrop of, there is a shortage of housing at the moment countrywide. So, local authorities and housing providers are going to always have to try and manage that. I just wonder, what do you think the Home Office could do to make a real change?
So moving across accommodation is a really frequent occurrence, both across hotels when they're in initial accommodation, because, often without reason, sometimes because the hotels have closed quite suddenly, and so individuals are dispersed or moved to another hotel in a completely different region without a proper assessment of what their needs are. Often we've seen families, for example, the Home Office have accepted that the families need to stay in this location because the mother is in a high-risk pregnancy and she's receiving specific medical treatment. But that's either forgotten or disregarded, and they're proposed to be dispersed in another place. So that's a really frequent issue, and one which I would really encourage the Home Office to reflect on, whether looking at closing hotels at the moment and how that's managed. Secondly, in terms of what the Home Office can do better, and I completely appreciate the issue with the shortage of accommodation and the stress of the housing market, I think from our perspective, the Home Office needs to improve the systems by which it assesses what people need. That there are significant failures in that process from the beginning of the initial screening of individuals throughout the time that they're in the asylum accommodation system. And I think those failures, it don't save time or money in the long run, it seems, because it has, someone will be moved to inadequate accommodation. That then has to be picked up through the supporting contractors, the voluntary services, legal aid lawyers. And so I think it's really important to get that system right and assess that need before you move people. And I think that's what's lacking.
Would you think that where this government is trying to lessen the hotels, that unless you get the systems right, whatever accommodation or whatever your plan is moving forward, without the safeguards, we're moving on in the wrong direction?
Completely. I'm really concerned that we'll see what we've seen in the past, where hotels are closed with limited notice, people are dispersed without any consideration, and it's not going to work. And regardless of what kind of accommodation people are placed in, unless you assess and respond to need, we'll be in the same position. Thank you.
Let me bring in Will Forster.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about communication escalation routes. So what has been your experience of working with the Home Office and their providers to resolve issues with asylum accommodation and make improvements to the system? And a particular question, I think, just to Alex. You've described asylum seekers experiencing inadequate and inconsistent communication from providers. Why do you think communication is such a challenge?
Well, I suppose building out from Meg's last answer, I mean, whatever's happening, people need to know, what's going on. And there are a range of reasons why often the communication isn't great. I think the starting point is perhaps one of those low levels of trust often. This is where communication isn't good, because I've spoken about where in some cases, of course, it is and it can be. I think there's sometimes an assumption because you have a guide about how things work and what goes on and how to raise a concern that people will have understood it, that they'll know it exists. Often when people come to us, and as I said, that can be a couple of months after they've moved into a particular hotel, they won't know about what their rights were, how to raise a complaint. They might have been experiencing something which is what they wanted to complain about but didn't feel safe to raise it because of that very reason. And so, again, it's part of this sort of very mixed and inconsistent picture that goes on around, who do people trust, people being clear on the processes to follow, people understanding at as early a point as possible what goes on, how things work, what their rights are. And, that earlier question around when a hotel is closed or when someone's moved from one hotel to another or from one accommodation setting to another, giving as much notice as possible, explaining to people what's going on, why it's happening. Because, as I'm sure any of us can understand, that can be a very distressing and disruptive moment. We put it in our written evidence, and we have examples every week of people who rightly are being moved from an accommodation setting where, for example, they might be a woman that's experienced sexual gender-based violence. They'd maybe had a poor initial vulnerability assessment process. They'd been moved into accommodation that wasn't sufficient for their needs. Perhaps it was in mixed-sex accommodation in a shared room without access to the local support that they would need. Maybe with intervention they've been moved to another hotel. They perhaps haven't realised what's going on, though. And we've had cases where people have been moved in the middle of the night with no notice. I can't imagine how distressing that would be. So I think there's some real basics going wrong. But again, it's the spectrum. Again, you will have examples of really good communication where people have been going that extra mile. Last week I was in Derby speaking to a team there about a great local initiative called the New Arrival Alliance. It's a thing that's been developed through partnership working between the voluntary sector, statutory organisations, local authority and people who have arrived into Derby, whether that's through the asylum system or through another scheme like Resettlement or the Homes for Ukraine scheme. The idea is you improve that system for everybody, but it's a great initiative. That's the kind of stuff we need to build on, because then you're more likely to have a culture which enables good communication to just happen and flow. But hopefully that's helpful in terms of some of that variation and differences that we see.
Thanks, Alex. Other panel members, what do you think about sort of the Home Office sort of working relationship?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's very variable. If we have an individual case and we go directly to officials in the Home Office, we will get action. At the local level, it's not necessarily the same. And look, the point I would make is that this hasn't been designed as a person-centred system that sees, to quote the most important finding, I think, from the Windrush inquiry, the face behind the case always. It is a system that is there to manage and to essentially provide a basic accommodation provision. It's not centred around the needs of individuals like a health system is. So given that, the consequences flow from that. Poor communication, poor assessment, poor information sharing, all those things. No consistent casework support, it's not built into the system. So inevitably, you get, more often than not, poor outcomes and poor quality and poor performance.
It sounds like you've said it depends on the circumstances, but you wouldn't immediately recommend we want a stronger Home Office presence directly in an accommodation to resolve issues. You don't think that?
It might make a bit of difference around the edges, but the system isn't designed with the person at the centre, so fundamentally you're not going to get the shift around quality of individual needs-based support that people require.
Thank you. Jake Richards.
I just want to ask about unaccompanied children and the particular challenges that affect, it's a very broad question, but the particular challenges that the system poses for those people. Alex, do you want to start, I think?
I've mentioned a couple of things already, but a bit like a range of the other challenges we find. So when it comes to the age-disputed children that we're supporting, and we supported about 600 age-disputed children in the last year or so, there's an inconsistent approach to how those concerns are acknowledged and responded to. I had an example just this morning. One of our managers sent me a note to say that they'd raised a concern about an age-disputed child who they were pretty sure was a child. They raised it with the accommodation provider. There was very little action they were aware of that had been taken. They then raised it with one of the statutory organisations and there was almost immediate action taken. So it's very mixed, very variable. And it's a recurrent theme, of course, in what we've all been saying. That shouldn't be the case. You should have good policy, good practice, good systems, good culture, and you should have consistency in how these concerns are responded to.
Just on this point that Enver just made as well about it's not person-centred. How much is that just to do with the contracts and the legal basis on which the system is founded, or how much is it to do with the cultural and political development of this issue and prominence of this issue?
A mixture of it all, you know. We've written a lot of reports over the years about the things that should really matter in terms of someone's experience in the asylum system when they're seeking protection. We wrote a report a few years ago called "We Want to Be Strong If Only We Had the Chance." It was written by women who are in the asylum system about what that's like. And so, if you don't design a system from a gender perspective, from a trauma perspective, you will end up with a system that delivers some of the outcomes it delivers today for people. And that means that you're too reliant then on good culture being developed that's likely to see things from a trauma-informed or gender-informed perspective, when it should be a given.
Sorry, back to the children. Does anyone else have anything they want to add in particular about that particular issue in the system?
Sorry. Yeah, I would just add that to reiterate that where a child's age is in doubt, the local authority has a duty to treat them as a child under legislation and statutory guidance, and that includes accommodating them as such. Yeah. And I think that's the piece that's often really missing. We find that often, we'll send formal pre-action correspondence to the local authority and they will act, depends, but reasonably quickly. But what should be happening, one assumes, is that the accommodation provider and the Home Office should be informing the local authority that there's an age-disputed child in their area and then making sure that action is actually taken. Instead, we see a huge number of age-disputed children in rooms with unrelated adult men, which is, as you can imagine, a really huge safeguarding issue, and for particularly age-disputed minors who have experienced torture and sexual assault and rape in some cases. I think it's a lack of a joined-up approach, perhaps, with the local authority too.
Sorry, just to press on that, is that... There's a wide range of issues, I'm sure, but is that just because they don't want... Why don't they raise this? Is it because they just don't want the trouble, they don't have the capacity, they don't know to do it? Is it a kind of head-in-the-sand culture amongst the professionals working there on the ground?
Not a very helpful response, but I think it's a mix of a lot of those things.
That seems to be the answer we're getting.
Yeah, I think particularly in unaccompanied age-disputed children, I think there is a culture of disbelief which permeates a lot of the Home Office's approach, and we see that in a lot of cases. I think that may be the main thing, really. And then I think probably, again, come back to the lack of training and monitoring for hotel staff who are the first point of call for these issues and who should be escalating it with the Home Office.
But I think there's a fundamental issue with the guidance here that the committee and that you should note is that as the guidance stands, effectively accommodation providers are told that as the Home Office has already conducted an age assessment, there has to be a high bar to referring for a further local authority-led assessment. So if the bar is set high and you're not an expert around age assessments and you're sat in a accommodation provision somewhere, then you're going to invariably think, well, no, I don't need to act here. And there are too many cases where the initial assessment on arrival around age has been flawed. And as a result, there are far too many children being put in potentially high-risk situations alongside adults in accommodation. And, I don't want to over-exaggerate, but we have evidence, and we've published it recently in a report to suggest that this is really a kind of hidden, simmering safeguarding crisis. And until there is some kind of appalling incident that takes place, I just don't think it's going to get the attention that it deserves, to be fair.
So just on that, you would recommend lowering the burden and having ongoing duty in guidance and training?
Yeah, absolutely. But we would also recommend that the initial assessment at port, and there's been evidence from the inspectorate on this, needs to be far better quality so that you don't have too many children, and it can happen the other way. Someone can be wrongly assessed as a child when they're an adult, so you don't get too many poor quality age assessments at port.
I know Joni Reid wants to come in, and I know Alex has got a comment. Have you finished?
Yeah, I'm done.
My question's already been answered by that.
So Alex, and then I'm going to bring you to Chris Murray.
Yeah, no, it was just to build slightly, I suppose, on Enver's point around initial screening and vulnerability assessment. And I think that there are recognised standards of ways of doing that better. And I think if you look at the UNHCR, they have some excellent recognised standards around initial screening and vulnerability assessment, not just the processes, but what's also required in terms of developing the right capability within a workforce. And I know that is part of the published work plan between UNHCR and Home Office as part of their operational framework. So that is encouraging, but we have to see that turn into practice, beyond the development stage. So, hopefully, over time, that will mean you have a much better process of initial screening and assessment. I mean, there's two part. The initial screening assessment needs to be much better. The inspection regime and monitoring needs to be much better. Those two things alone can make the world of difference.
Chris Murray.
Thanks very much. I want to focus on safeguarding a bit more, but not just on children, for the whole asylum population. You've talked a lot about the very sort of poor evidence of safeguarding in hotels, and also alluded to sometimes it being effective as well. So I wonder, what's your explanation for why you get sometimes good safeguarding but mainly poor safeguarding in asylum hotels? And my question is, do you think that's to do with the design of the contracts or the delivery of the contracts? I'm trying to work out where you're placing the responsibility.
I think local leadership makes a big difference. If you've got somebody, if you've got somebody who's responsible for a hotel, and they are setting the right culture, ensuring the right practices going on. I've given a couple of examples already of where there are people who do go above and beyond, set up particular situations, probably beyond of what they're required to do. But that's rooted, I think, in culture, which begins with the local leadership, whoever that might be in that place. But that equally, the other side of that coin is where you've got the wrong sort of a lack of leadership or poor culture, you'll get the opposite.
Can I just be clear about local? You mean the contractors in the hotels, so Serco, Mears or Clear Springs staff? It's
whoever's, be whoever's responsible for delivering that service on the ground. It's often the on-the-ground experience is where you get the biggest variation.
Yeah. Sorry, Enver, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I was just going to say that I think there are fundamental issues at play here. I think there's an absence of a cohesive and sufficiently robust safeguarding framework. I think the specific contractual standards around safeguarding in the contracts are not good enough. And I think there's a lack of detailed accountability mechanisms that significantly, create problems in the system. There's a lack of training. Accommodation providers, those working in hotels or in other accommodation settings, don't have sufficient knowledge and expertise around safeguarding. I think there's a lack of information sharing that we've already heard about, which results in poor quality knowledge then carrying with the individual. So when they're present in an accommodation setting, they can have their safeguarding needs met. And I think these configuration of issues result in poor safeguarding provision. I know local authorities are seriously concerned about this, the lack of connection from people, particularly that have been placed in hotels, and information sharing with local safeguarding boards and functions at the local level has been really shocking. There's been cases of people being placed in hotels who are very vulnerable with high safeguarding needs, and the local safeguarding authority, the local authority, hasn't been aware of that.
Yeah, prepared about that. Yeah. Megan, did you want to come in?
I would just add that we have consistently asked for disclosure of the training materials that the Home Office oversees from the accommodation providers, and clarity over whether that training is then passed down or mandated to be given to subcontractors, and have never been successful in obtaining that. And so I would ask the committee, in working with the Home Office, to really understand, what does the training, I think this is a massive safeguarding issue, what does the training look like? We have, at least as the solicitors, have no idea whatsoever. And so I think that would be really important, especially if the contracts are going to continue past the break clause.
So just as a follow-up to that, you've talked about vast variability across the asylum system. There only are 3 accommodation providers. Would you want to comment on which one you've seen as most effective at safeguarding, or if you see particular problems in particular regions or types of hotels, or would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm too eager. Yes, a major problem is subcontractors, I think. And we saw that recently with Stay Belvedere Hotels being told, Clear Springs being told that they needed to end their contract with them. there is a real lack of transparency over subcontractors, over who's actually being used, what are the checks, what are the training, what are the experiences, what's the oversight. And I think, I don't know, your views might be wrong, but I think that probably causes a huge amount of the variation. In terms of depending on accommodation providers being better, I can't say that one is better or worse than the other. I do think the same issues occur across. So it must inevitably be at least part of this subcontracting framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's variability, but I think fundamentally the contracts don't have sufficiently robust safeguarding requirements within them, and that is a fundamental flaw. And I think there's also a fundamental failure of those providing the accommodation, whether they're welfare managers working for the three providers, they don't have the ability to identify safeguarding risks and needs and to understand when they meet the statutory requirement for intervention. Also, if you have in a hotel, for example, one welfare manager for 200, 300 people, how are they possibly going to be able to do that?
Yeah, that ratio that Emma's just mentioned, that can be a real problem, as can the subcontracting that Meg mentioned. And, you know, and sometimes you can see a great development from a sort of from a standards point of view, like the minimum standards for responding to survivors of domestic abuse. But the challenge is, how do you know that that's being put into practice? And where's the oversight, as we've been saying, on the training, on the monitoring, on the evaluating what goes on at it's that last mile stuff again, you know, that very local, on the ground level, what's going on, because that's what tends to have the least sort of scrutiny, particularly when it's sort of a subcontractor.
Yeah. We do need to move on to the next panel, and I know there's lots of other questions that we have. Can I thank you for your contributions today? If there's anything further that you would want to give to the committee, please do share your thoughts with us, and it may well be that we come back to you with further questions as well, because as we're going through this process, we're finding there's many questions that we have. So thank you so much for your time. Apologies, Chris, for cutting you off, but we will have another panel coming up. So I conclude this. Order. We now move on to our second panel of this evidence this afternoon on the asylum accommodation contracts. Very grateful to be joined by representatives from local government. I'm going to start with Frances, who is joining us remotely. Perhaps you could introduce yourself, Frances.
Good afternoon, Chair. Frances McMeeking, and I am the Assistant Chief Officer of Social Work with the responsibility for homelessness, asylum and refugee for the City of Glasgow.
Thank you very much. Paul.
So my name is Paul Dennett. I'm the Mayor of Salford and the Deputy Mayor for the Greater Manchester Combined Authority.
Hello, Natasha Beresford, Strategic Director for Housing and Property Services for Dacorum Borough Council.
And Councillor Peter Mason, the leader of the London Borough of Ealing, and here on behalf of the LGA board.
Thank you very much. So we're now going to move on to questions around how equitable the distribution of accommodation is. I'm going to start with Margaret Malone.
Okay, thank you. This is to Mayor Dennett and then Francis. The plans that the Home Office have got to equitable distribution, do you think it's going to be fair, and do you think personally that it will work?
So I think we've been calling for equitable distribution for some time, and obviously in 2022, we saw the Immigration Minister mandate the widening of dispersal. And I think since then, we've certainly seen some progress across the country, but certainly from a Greater Manchester point of view, I still feel we have an unsustainable share of the national asylum population. And outside of London, the northwest actually, as a region, has a disproportionate requirement to provide services and accommodation to people seeking asylum. So we have 8% of the national total in Greater Manchester. That's 28 people in every 10,000 of the population. The UK rate is 15 per 10,000, and we have 30% of our total living in contingency hotel accommodation, and we have 433 children. So for me, I think we've got a long way to go to get to where the government ultimately wants to be. And I think we've got to be really honest about there are a number of local authorities in this country who haven't really played ball with the agenda in terms of receiving people seeking asylum and refugees. So the government does have a tough job on its hands to get some of those local authorities that have clearly resisted engaging with this agenda for many, many years to actually start receiving people seeking asylum and playing part of what is a national response to an emergency, ultimately.
Thank you. Francis?
Thank you. So Glasgow was the only dispersal area in Scotland up until 2022, and it remains a significant challenge in the city currently, with 94% of all asylum cases being accommodated in the city. Currently, mayors have over 1,800 properties in the city, so that's having an impact, as you would appreciate, on the property availability. So currently, Glasgow is operating at 400% above the dispersal plan. There's been limited and slow movement in terms of properties via mayors across the rest of Scotland, with now 19 local authorities agreeing to accommodate people within their local authority area out of the other 31 local authorities. So it remains a distinct difference in terms of proportionality, in terms of having to accommodate asylum seekers in the city, which is having obviously wider impacts: health, social care and education, to name just a few. There is also a wider issue in Scotland about a lack of progress around a rural procurement strategy, despite the efforts of a number of local authorities who would want to engage meaningfully with the Home Office around how that would look and how that would be managed. So again, there is opportunities going forward to do more work around increasing the pipeline across the wider portfolio in Scotland. But there's a lot of comments already in our response about some of the challenges that this presents to Glasgow.
Thank you. And could I ask you both, do you think that the Home Office should have some levers to sort of try and help make this happen so it's fair and equitable? And I think what my question would be as well is what do local areas need for it? What's a good outcome really for local areas in the asylum dispersal?
Councillor Mason, I think. Mark.
Yeah. So I think in the context of full dispersal from 2022 onwards, we have actually seen local authorities very much increasingly step up to the plate. We've now got 106 additional local authorities providing asylum accommodation in localities, and that's part of the agreement, of course, in which local authorities sign up to regional targets. As has been identified, one of the significant challenges in achieving fair distribution, and it's right to say, that there is disproportionality at the moment. About 10 local authorities are currently accommodating about 22% of asylum seeker population. That we actually do need to see a shift in the way that accommodation is procured through providers. And I think there are challenges, not just in terms of the aspects of rural areas that have been identified, but equally providers perhaps focusing too closely on accommodation costs. And of course that invariably ends up meaning that there is a focus towards parts of northern England rather than London and rather than the southeast, and of course in urban locations. And there is certainly a degree of concentration there. What we would like to see is greater collaboration between the Home Office and, of course, with providers agreeing and sticking to the allocations that are contained within regional targets. And if we're able to do that more clearly, some of the challenges that were identified by the previous panel around actually competition for housing in the current market between programmes that are sponsored by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in terms of resettlement, in addition to all of the challenges that local government are facing at the moment through temporary accommodation and homelessness, we can have a better, more coordinated approach to vulnerability of people in our housing stock.
Natasha, do you want to?
So just, I think, to add, the reality is that there is the same inequitable distribution of dispersal within the eastern region. So since the dispersal programme has been widened, there are the same 7 local authorities in the east that have continued to have increased dispersal within their local authority areas, despite those local authorities having achieved plan and dispersal continues within those ongoing areas. One of the factors that we consider, as referenced by both the first panel and by Councillor Peter Mason, is the inequitable arrangements that are in existence in respect of the contract, in particular the arrangements that enable procurement in less expensive areas and the issues that arise in being able to procure accommodation in those more expensive urban areas, and particularly those with proximity to London, for the East, the disparity that exists in between the two providers.
Francis wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. In reference to Scotland, there is a geographical imbalance where mayors seek to procure their DA property. So in Scotland, we've currently 13 local authorities that have declared a housing crisis, and undoubtedly this is contributing to the lack of suitable accommodation across the country. But perversely, as my colleagues have referenced, the contract seems to be based solely on relatively cheap pricing of properties, and therefore that is driving mayors' agenda about where they can procure those properties in available areas. And such areas can often face a variety of deprivation and socio-economic imbalance, which leads to concern about community cohesion in those areas, and is counter to the equitable approach to dispersal that's outlined in the plan for 2022. So there's a converse effect on communities in terms of that strategy.
I'm going to bring Paul in, but can I just press on the point around the Home Office levers? Do they have the levers they need to make the distribution equitable? Paul?
So the Home Office obviously have engaged in a contract here. Do I know the specifics of that contract? No, but nevertheless, I think the government embraced new public management many, many years ago, and the whole notion of contracting and commissioning the delivery of services was deemed a way of efficiently discharging our responsibilities. So the contract should provide the government, and certainly the Home Office in this case, with the levers to genuinely deliver accountability and good outcomes for the people we seek to serve. I would like to think if it isn't written in that way, then we have a bit of a problem, and it's back to the drawing board with the lawyers, dare I say, in terms of renegotiating that contract. But fundamentally, I think we need to move away from a cost-driven approach to procurement. This is a commercial contract. It's about making profit at the end of the day. Therefore, the providers will always go to those areas of the country where housing values are the lowest. And I think we need to be really honest about that. You know, can, in my case, Serco procure expensive properties in certain parts of even my own city, the city of Salford, where we do not have properties being procured. But in certain wards of the city, we are way over the quota for the overall city. So we need to do that. We need to hold them to account. And I think there's something about public transparency here and the Home Office getting information out into the public domain to hold providers to account. But we also need to increase our presence in other regions as well. You know, it's not up until fairly recently, I would say, under the current government, we've started to get a bit more transparency around how the North West actually compares with other regions of the country. We've not always been able to compare ourselves and contrast ourselves to ensure others are playing ball. But we also need to reduce those properties in areas where we are overplanned. And I know of a number of wards across Greater Manchester where that is seriously the case. But with that does come challenges. Colleagues have already talked about rurality, and therefore the offer, the service delivery model, needs to reflect that. It needs to be different. Transportation, support infrastructure, and ensuring that those services and access to those services is at the heart of the contract and how the contract is ultimately being delivered. I guess what I would finish on, though, is I think there's a huge opportunity for the Home Office to deepen their collaboration with local authorities, with combined authorities, with regional strategic migration partnerships to properly get better outcomes from the current existing contractual relationships.
Yeah, if I could ask Councillor Mason as well, what do local areas need to do for asylum dispersal to function well? Because we all know when it goes wrong what it looks like, but what does it look like when it goes well?
Yeah, well, I think we have to bear in mind that very often local communities completely understand, as local authorities do, their sort of duty and their responsibility in supporting and providing networks of support to those who are going through the process of dispersal. And there are plenty of voluntary and community sector organisations, not least the ones who presented to you and those in networks at the previous session, who step into the breach often when required to ensure that they're providing the wraparound support that quite often the providers of accommodation are not able or are not providing. The challenge is, to some extent, and I think we all also need to bear in mind the broader context of general needs housing in the country, which is the procurement of accommodation inside an environment of a contracting market, not least the private rented sector, and of course the slowdown in house building that we've seen over the last certainly a few years as a consequence of inflation and interest rates and the rises in build costs, etc., mean that it's an incredibly difficult market from which to procure from. Essentially, it has been identified, really reducing or targeting procurement in lots of particular locations and causing the challenges that therefore it does. So we can't see this in isolation outside of the broader housing challenge. And if that's going to be alleviated, then you have to look at general needs housing supply as much as anything else. Local authorities, up until very recently, weren't funded for the activity that is happening to support asylum seekers and in those locations. And of course, in the year that's now started, that the funding has increased, and that's very welcome. But as is always the case in local government, particularly in local government finance, the sporadic nature of year-on-year funding means that long-term planning is incredibly difficult. And dispersal accommodation, contingency accommodation may well be, turned on or off in particular time periods, but dispersal accommodation is pretty consistent. And what local authorities would really need in the funding context is for this area of responsibility and duty to be considered inside the comprehensive spending review and local government finance settlements to ensure that it's adequately funded so that we can plan for the long term.
Okay, and final question to everybody. How should equity of distribution be balanced against other considerations? You've all mentioned it, such as cost.
So I think from my perspective, just in respect of equity of distribution, coming back to Paul's previous point, it's important to look at the contractual elements and ensure that the focus isn't around profit-driven activity, and that the regional aspects around the market position are considered in respect of the contracts. That's critical. Failure to do that will result in discrepancies across regions and within regions, in particular inflating the market, the unintended consequence of which inflating the private sector market directly contributing to homelessness, and the challenges that have already been talked to in respect of pressures on your wider infrastructure, increasing demand in respect of local authorities in terms of households in temporary accommodation, and being able to prevent homelessness, and by which I mean the inability to prevent homelessness by use of the private sector because of that direct competitive activity that is happening within a region. So, for example, issues that we are seeing currently are providers playing off local authorities and provider in order to inflate the market and incentivising landlords who come to the table to support procurement of dispersal.
Murray wanted to come in.
I just very quickly come in just on this equity point. Because basically you seem to be saying that the contractors are pursuing the cheapest accommodation they can get, and that's leading to distortions. But on the other hand, the cost has risen from 18,000 per asylum seeker per year to 41,000 last year. So how do you square those two facts? Because the costs have just utterly ballooned, and not to put words in your mouth, but the backlog is what people tend to tell us, like the fact the backlog is growing, although it's still a per capita increase. Does that sufficiently explain it from your perspective?
I think Francis wanted to come in.
Chair, I was going to speak to the previous point, which is just about to be more transparent about the pipeline data and procurement process. So our experiences in Scotland is that despite hundreds of properties being considered, it's a very, very small percentage that are actually then procured, and we get no information about why the rest have been discounted or not continued. So there's real disconnect, and certainly lots of work from local authorities to work with mayors in our case to make sure they're identifying the right property, so the failure rate is not as so significant, but it's less than 10% that are finally procured.
So, I mean, for me, one of the key drivers here is the chronic lack of truly affordable housing, which is driving the costs. So we all know the impact of right to buy. We all know the language games that have been played with affordable housing, certainly since 2011, when the National Planning Policy Framework incorporated a definition which talked about affordability being 80% of market rents, having absolutely no relationship whatsoever with the local housing allowance and welfare benefits. We all know the impact of welfare reforms, and obviously the chronic undersupply of truly affordable housing, i.e. housing at social rents and local housing allowance. And the cumulative impact of all of that over time is colossal. So now the government has no choice but to depend on the market ultimately in the private rented sector to discharge some of its duties around the asylum contracts it has with the three organisations that have already been mentioned. So for me, the primary driver is absolutely what's happening within housing. Obviously throw into the mix inflation, throw into the mix ineffective contract management, and goodness knows what levels of profit are being made here. Throw into the mix the transaction costs that have to be paid for around what is an elaborate system here. And yeah, you've got a real challenge on your hand in terms of how you get those costs down, because where do you place people? There is a dependency here on the market, which has been created over time by consecutive decisions of government.
Anyone else want to come in? Natasha.
Just to add to that point, costs are very much likely to have significantly risen because of the incentives that are being provided and paid to landlords in order to achieve the dispersal requirements. So examples of discussions that we as a local authority have had with landlords is that they are being directly proposed and offered incentives of £7,000 per property in order to acquire units. Local authorities aren't able to compete in that market, and there you see ceiling prices driven up.
Thank you.
And that's in the eastern region?
Yes.
Thank you. Your provider is Serco?
We have two providers, Serco and Clisprings Ready Homes.
Jenny Reid.
Thank you. So if the model, as you've just said, shouldn't be driven by cost, what would a new procurement model look like? What should be the criteria, if out with what you've already said about equitable dispersion? What should be the criteria by which we should select asylum accommodation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I guess from my perspective, Paul touched on earlier the importance of working collaboratively with local authorities and strategic migration teams. We would absolutely welcome those conversations. It's important to understand the nuances of a region, but also the nuances that exist within a region, ensuring that contracts are considerate of the market and the decisions and parameters placed within the contract are based on affordability and average market levels.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I think, as has been said, I think the collaboration between the Home Office and local authorities, of course, can always be strengthened to have a proper understanding of local need, and particularly in areas of particularly high demand, and, as I say, in urban locations where some of that disproportionality happens. Whilst the housing market continues to be in the situation that it is in, and whilst we continue to see very low levels of starts on site, for example, of general needs housing and, of course, affordable housing, that the situation, I'm afraid, feels like it's only going to get worse necessarily before it is going to get better. But much of that also needs to be done in a planned way with local authorities, so we can also ensure that the appropriate support, the wraparound support, and I'm sure some of the discussions that we're going to get into later around safeguarding and vulnerability are put in place too. Too often, I think, is the case at the moment, local authorities perhaps feel that decisions are being taken to them rather than with them in relation to the speed of particularly contingency accommodation in terms of how quickly it's brought on stream. But local government, of course, is always ready to step up and step into the discussions that we need to have to operationalise accommodation where it needs to happen. And very often, it's always the case, actually, that a local authority will have a very deep understanding of its local housing market. We will know that from all of our interactions, from other elements of our activity, whether it's the planning and licensing functions, or indeed our responsibilities in fire, health and safety and building control. We have a deep understanding of our housing markets, and that's the type of intelligence that we'd love to deploy into the decisions that are being taken by the Home Office, by providers, and in the subcontracting conversations that those providers are having to locate homes.
Yeah, I think what I would say is if your default is looking at the contract between the providers and the Home Office, then the relationship has fundamentally failed, and all the contract literature, academic literature corroborates that. This is about trust and confidence. This is about trying to think systemically about this, i.e. what is the relationship between, in our case, Serco, the Home Office, the combined authority, the 10 local authorities of Greater Manchester, importantly the voluntary community faith and social enterprise sector, and how do we all work together as a single system to genuinely discharge our duties, but also primarily to support people seeking asylum and refugees. And within that space, how do we co-produce? How do we give voice to the very people we're trying to provide services to? And how do we assure ourselves, really, as a collective system, that what we're doing is actually genuinely meeting need and driving outcomes? I think we've got a long way to go. I think at the moment there's an opportunity to think cross-departmentally on this agenda and to really drive an agenda of integration-focused support, ultimately, involving local government, involving regional strategic migration partnerships. At the moment, local government financing, as we know, is going through a review. Minister McMahon is undertaking a whole-scale review of that. That is an opportunity for me to properly consider this agenda and the relationship between MHCLG and ultimately the Home Office, specifically with regards to trying to get us into that space where we've got flexible multi-year funding settlements linked to the flow of asylum seekers within the system. So this isn't just about allocating money to local authorities, it's allocating on the basis of where do asylum seekers go and how do we support services and actors, if you like, within those spaces, as well as those wider impacts on services and accommodation. And I think there's a huge opportunity before us now, and maybe devolution also provides us with an opportunity to think differently about how we discharge this contractual relationship.
What would your advice to the Home Office be to facilitate better this collaborative working, to ensure that if we're going to continue with the kind of contracting with the hotels, to make sure that there's better collaborative working than there is working for local authorities and the local area more effectively? Are there any real kind of actions or improvements that you would like to see come from the Home Office specifically?
I think for me, emphasis on trust, collaboration and clear communication, transparency is key. I think Peter and Paul have talked about the importance of a whole system approach and also looking cross-departmentally. There are a lot of opportunities, notwithstanding what's already been shared, but to look at the wider pressures on the system. For example, within our region, we have explored with our providers the opportunity to tap into the empty homes market. So nationally there are a significant number of empty dwellings and within one local authority area. For us, thousands of empty dwellings. Those are a vital untapped resource that are currently not explored in respect of the opportunity that may provide. Emphasis already provided in respect of safeguarding and community cohesion and ensuring wraparound support. That is critical for me. And I would really like to see greater integration with safeguarding adults boards in respect of the contract and contract oversight, but also ensuring that the voluntary sector are considered in respect of the wider infrastructure asks.
Anything to add, Francis?
I think, we certainly, in the context of the government's sort of direction on contingency accommodation and scaling away hotels, there are local governance pilots that are happening in different parts of the country that are looking at better models for doing precisely what's been described. And I think hopefully, as those sort of work their way through development, we will develop those models. Those conversations are currently happening. To establish if there are different mechanisms and different models that can be deployed to get better outcomes. I think I'd concur with my fellow panelists that the current situation is not fit for purpose, and hopefully those pilots will produce some positive results.
Thank you. Can I just check with you? Francis, you wanted to come in, didn't you?
It was actually about the pilots, because I do think that is a positive change in direction, and that has been approached in a very open and transparent way, and lots of dialogue with local authorities about what can be achieved, specifically in my case anyway in Scotland, around support models, which the transparency around what's currently provided has been sadly lacking over a number of years. So that relates back to the comments from colleagues, particularly in relation to safeguarding. One other area that we are very keen in Scotland to work through is the data sharing issues. So for a whole range of vital information, I can't stress how vital it is around safeguarding in particular, that we've seen regress in the last 2 years. So we get less and less information, and that then makes it difficult to work in partnership and in a cohesive way in terms of that joined up approach across really, really significant pieces of work about community planning, cohesion, and the strategic planning that goes in a city around accommodation and affordable housing. So data sharing might sound a small issue, but it's absolutely critical to the relationship.
We've heard that from other local authorities on the ground. My final question, obviously the nature of migration is you are going to see these surges. I know we all want certainty around numbers. Is there anything the Home Office can do to help you with contingency planning for when we do see these spikes?
I think it's about early notification. So, of course, there are going to be situations in which there are surge. Unfortunately, that's the nature, as you say, of what is happening. There are protocols in place to ensure that we should be being notified as local authorities of the Home Office's intention to open a contingency hotel or a contingency large, medium-sized site in a particular area. Sometimes the aspiration isn't necessarily met with the delivery. The commitment to that protocol is incredibly important, not least because, as it's worth repeating, we're dealing with incredibly traumatised, vulnerable people for whom don't just require a roof over their heads, they also require a series of support services particularly unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, who will of course need direct access to, and our social services will need direct access to them, but a whole range of services that need to be operationalised very quickly. What local government continue to do is to do that very effectively and very efficiently when we can, and there are great examples of local authorities that have done that at breakneck speed, but that commitment to sort of communication, clarity, timelines, open dialogue on the accommodation that may be being proposed, and any challenges that might be had with the quality of that accommodation, very often local authorities will be able to provide that, as I say, that expert guidance on the local housing market to be able to address any of those challenges.
I'll move on to Margaret Mullane, who has got questions around the adequacy of accommodation and support, and hopefully we'll bring in other points on that.
Yeah, so we've heard consistently from the previous panel, and it's kind of been raised today, about the adequacy of the accommodation. Do you think the Home Office, I think, again, this has been answered, but I'd be interested to see what you think the way forward is do you think the Home Office has a strong enough oversight of what the providers are delivering on the ground?
From my perspective, no. An example of a contingency hotel within our region, and in fact directly within my local authority region, is our engagement with the Home Office has been very slow when raising significant and really pertinent issues. In some examples, issues of community cohesion, community safety, significant concerns around antisocial behaviour, and we have had to draw on community safety partnership governance structures in order to effect action. Policing have had to be drawn into very, very difficult discussions which have been protracted and very drawn out over months, many months. And in examples that were being presented to the Home Office in respect of this site were met with delays and the need to verify their assurance arrangements in respect of safeguarding. That's still, after 5 months, not fully verified in respect of that site. So significant issues in relation to impacts around mental health, threats to kill, serious incidents and use of weapons, concerns from residents on site that unreasonable force is often used by members of security when dealing with incidents on site. So very significant. And in this particular example, our policing colleagues, as part of the partnership, enacted policing powers to take action by service of a community protection warning on the providers in order to try and effect change. Mitigations provided on site were provided by the two-tier local authorities rather than the provider and the Home Office themselves. And it took several months before Home Office teams and the managing directors of the providers, before they actually visited site to inspect for themselves.
So when we've been visiting sites, I won't name the particular site, there was accusations of security bullying, really, for want of and you would, like what you've just related to us, the Home Office would have little or no idea of that going on.
Correct. Until that's shared with them directly by the local authority. Yeah. And information that had been shared in this example was overwhelming. Significant indicators of policing logs around the volume of attendance at the site, and in fact calls to policing from individuals working on site that they needed help, they couldn't contain and manage the situation. We were wholly unassured of the appropriate mitigation and safeguarding arrangements on that site. And I heard on the previous panel individuals requesting site of safeguarding training that was delivered. After 4 months of asking, we were able to see site of a training pack that had been delivered to staff, but it was for a site not within our region. And for a different provider, and when engaging with officers working on the ground, they couldn't clearly indicate to you what their safeguarding escalating arrangements were and what their protocol would be in a serious incident. So the mitigation provided within this particular community is provided by the local authority. So my kind of plea in this situation would be that the local authority has the experience in respect of safeguarding adults and children, and that any contract and future arrangements must draw on the existing arrangements that lie with the local authority.
We've got some questions about safeguarding and vulnerable people from Joni, and then move on and refugee homelessness from Chris, and then we'll wrap up with the future, but start with Joni.
So our understanding is that in the Home Office has emphasised that the safeguarding duty doesn't lie with the provider, but with the local authority. What do you think should be the role of the Home Office in safeguarding vulnerable people within its accommodation, and what should that process and model look like?
Yes, from my perspective, drawing on the comments from the previous panel, there was a real focus on ensuring robust needs assessment and that accommodation was reflective of an individual's needs. That's really important, ensuring that there's a person-centred approach.
Who do you think should do that?
The Home Office should set the parameters in liaison with migration partnerships and local authorities. We have the experience and the knowledge. Heard earlier from the panel about the wealth of experience that we have and we deploy on a daily basis in supporting vulnerable individuals across our communities, be that individuals who are victims of domestic abuse, victims of crime, and so on. The experience lies with us, and the steer and the advice in respect of that, I would expect collaboration in terms of developing those arrangements. The Home Office should employ, in my opinion, an audit and assurance function that is robust and reflective of those agreed arrangements.
Yeah, so certainly in Greater Manchester, we've been receiving a reported increase in the presentations of age-disputed young people, specifically within adult hotels. And I think that points initially, thinking about responsibility here, to the adequacy of the process in terms of determining people's age, and that happens at the port. So arguably, there's an ask here for the Home Office and border control in terms of the process that's gone through before these individuals even enter into that contractual relationship with the Home Office. And then we've got real concerns with regards to the speed with which provider referrals are shared with children's services, for example, within local authorities. And within the contract, we understand there's a lack of contractual requirement to actually retain separate bedrooms when there are these issues of age disputes within the hotels. So for me, there is some practical things we can do here to address some of these real safeguarding concerns. So there is, I think, a number of opportunities to prevent, to manage vulnerabilities within the contract, but ultimately it's about working quickly and working with those partners that are the local authorities, combined authorities, regional strategic migration partnerships, to properly deliver a system here where we've got a coherent view of the truth, and we're working promptly and rapidly when we have got safeguarding and welfare concerns.
Beyond that initial assessment that you mentioned, how can you have an effective model whereby the welfare officer, or is it possible to have an effective model whereby the welfare officer is doing that assessment? Because surely the initial, when they arrive at port, all of their safeguarding issues might not come out at that moment in time. So is it possible to have a good, robust relationship with the provider so that you're able to identify any emerging safeguarding issues? Do you think that's done effectively at the moment, or does it have to?
So I think the Home Office has actually made some recent changes which are to be positively welcome, but it's within the hotel accommodation, it's not within the dispersal accommodation, where they literally have people on site supporting people seeking asylum with the whole sort of induction, orientation process. You know, let's get this right. These are people coming to this country, fleeing their home country, often not being able to speak our language. You know, giving them a welcome to the UK pack and wishing them the best is not the model. And I think the Home Office more recently has started to address some of that with people on site in hotel accommodation, providing that support around e-visas, for example, some of the changes recently, but also that information, advice and guidance, the signposting that anyone would naturally need coming to a community that they don't know and have very little awareness about. So for me, ramping that up, obviously across all hotels, but also ensuring it's available for dispersal accommodation, so accommodation that isn't hotel, seems like an obvious next step, really.
I think just to follow on from that, ensuring consistency across all regions and providers, because in my experience there isn't consistency in those arrangements in hotels, and there's often a significant time delay, and in some cases somebody's in crisis before those referrals and the relevant arrangements are stood up, and in instances we've been directly engaged with individuals have been hospitalised because those delays haven't been acted upon. So I think they can be built into contracts, but I think you need the advice and the expertise of the relevant parties around the table to ensure that that is done robustly.
And if I may, just on the issue of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children and the assessment at port, in terms of sort of underscoring its importance, there was a series of freedom of information requests that were made for a period of 6 months in the end of 2024 that demonstrated that there had been about 603 referrals from contingency hotels in about 63 local authorities, where after assessment 50% of those individuals who are thought to be adults were actually children. And that's a significant cause for concern for local authorities, not least, of course, because of the outcomes for those children in receiving the care and support that they need. Partly, this is also a practical concern. If assessed at port, a child who is an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child is allocated to the National Transfer Scheme according to an allocation rate that means that local authorities are not really exceeding the quota of 0.1% of child population. If those children invariably are assessed incorrectly and find themselves in adult hotels that are then subsequently assessed, the local authority does become rightly responsible for their care arrangements. But of course, in some circumstances, that's meant that one local authority alone found themselves having to find accommodation for an additional 20 looked after children following assessment. And that is a significant pressure on a local authority care team who invariably will be dealing with a caseload that quite often, in the current context, will be very high in the first place. So that point on vulnerability and the assessment of age at port is incredibly important.
And if I can just follow on from that point, that last point is really key in terms of the local authority position, but also in respect of two-tier local authorities where your safeguarding responsibility sits with the upper. Funding is provided at the lower tier, and so you have nuances around the arrangements and the funding powers and sharing that is in place between those local authorities, and that is something that needs to be considered further.
And move on to Chris Murray.
Thanks very much. So I just want to ask a question about once a decision on someone's case has been made and they've been granted refugee status. So the Home Office, obviously a lot of these are single men. The Home Office has, first of all, extended the move-on period. I wonder what your views are on that. Secondly, I want to ask about the impact on your homelessness provision for the local authority in the round general homeless provision. What's the impact on that? And then finally, do you have any suggestions of how the process on move on could be improved?
With Francis.
Thanks, Chair. So in relation to the 56 days, it's had limited, we welcome it. We think it's definitely a step in the right direction, but thus far it's had limited impacts. We are still seeing the 28-day notice period. And within my own services, particularly in Glasgow, we have got a really robust asylum refugee bridging team that reach into the hotel environment to work with households and families as they move into the community. So really, really appreciate the 56 days, but we've seen no evidence of that thus far the last 4 months. And moving to your question about homelessness, it's been well publicised, the challenge that's presented to the city. So at the moment, 42% of our homeless applications are from refugee households who have either travelled to the city from out with Glasgow or have been given leave to remain in the city. So it's a significant pressure where we've seen a 39% increase in 2 years in our overall homeless applications. And that's quite disproportionate to the rest of Scotland. I think I've already explained that, but really disproportionate in terms of that demand on housing.
Just to follow on from that, so in our experience in the East, largely the 56-day notification is working and is in operation, but that is reliant on local authorities ensuring that they deploy resource to ensure that they are checking daily for new notifications of decisions being issued. One of the challenges that does exist, however, is the way that funding is allocated in respect of bed spaces rather than people. So in Hertfordshire, by way of example, what we see are several hotels being utilised as feeder hotels, so where funding is provided per bed space rather than individual. There is a significant churn in respect of individuals, adding pressure to the system. And what that does, particularly in the case of large volumes of single males, increases pressures on night shelters, other food bank provision, and we're also seeing growing pressures in relation to community cohesion and modern slavery activity.
So on the 56 days, I think it's positive, and I think it should be maintained permanently. Obviously, the parity with the Homelessness Reduction Act is something we certainly welcome and have campaigned for previously. In terms of move on, though, there are inevitably challenges here because, this isn't existing in a vacuum. This is happening at the same time that we've got a huge housing and homelessness crisis, which is playing out disproportionately in different parts of the country. And, to give you some key stats for Greater Manchester, 5,819 households currently in temporary accommodation, costing us £75 million per year, much of which we can't reclaim either through the housing benefit subsidy system. 8,342 of those people in the temporary accommodation are children. And that's up 968% since 2010. So it gives you a real indication of how this is playing out disproportionately in different parts of the country. 90,301 households sit on our housing waiting lists across the 10 local authorities across Greater Manchester. And since September 2024, the data tells us that 856 of the households are in bed and breakfast accommodation, which is a useful proxy for how difficult it is to actually procure truly affordable housing because of all of the supply challenges we talked about earlier. And within those households, 395 include households with children, and that's up 1,262% since 2010. So considering this needs to be considered within the broader context of homelessness, rough sleeping, and obviously we had the absolute crisis when the government introduced accelerated asylum, which in principle is a really good thing. What government didn't do at the time, though, was work with local authorities and combined authorities to properly plan for the consequences of that. And my local authority did not budget for what we had to do in terms of establishing a welfare hub so people were not sleeping rough on our streets at night in the run-up to Christmas, in the winter months. Shocking, really. But that has cost us nearly £500,000 so far, the welfare hub, since we've had to step that up. And that's just in Salford. That's one of the local authorities. So for me, what I was saying earlier about that collaboration and that partnership, I do genuinely think there's a huge opportunity here for the Home Office to work with combined authorities and local government and the LGA in coming up with a much better way of working, because this crisis management that we're grappling with time and time again, whether that's being told within a week a hotel's going to be set up, whether that's the consequences of accelerated asylum, there has got to be a better way of delivering all of this that puts people at the heart of what this contract is all about, and whatever that contract looks like in the future. I'm absolutely convinced there are better ways of operating the current asylum system.
That takes me on to the final question, which is, I think, a question for all of you. I'll take you each in turn, but we want to make recommendations of how to improve this contractual relationships from a local government point of view, from a local authority point of view. How could this be made better? Shall we start? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I think what fundamentally what local authorities need is a coherent and open seat at a table that is based on a regional and sub-regional plan, a place-based plan, not just for asylum hotels, whether that's contingency or whether that's dispersal accommodation in the context of the Home Office, but also in relation to the other accommodation pressures from other government departments, whether that's the Foreign Commonwealth Office, of course, for the resettlement programmes, and of course MHCLG in the wider context of the provision of temporary accommodation and other forms of accommodation in the current market. I think the commitment to do that in a better way is recognised in the conversations that are happening around some of those trials as we move forward to hopefully the end of the use of hotels by the 2029 in the life of this Parliament. But that commitment to an open dialogue is incredibly important, because we need really to move away, as has rightly been highlighted, from crisis management to effective planning. And that equally needs to be recognised in the context of local authorities and their resourcing. We are no longer in a situation where, particularly in dispersal accommodation, this is somehow a new or different duty. This is now mainstream activity that local authorities are performing, and rightly so, across the range of support and safeguarding and social care services. And that needs to be appropriately considered in the context of the long-term funding of local authorities too.
So what role should the local authorities have, and should it be mandatory or voluntary? Under full dispersal, it is mandatory, and as we've sort of said, local authorities are all signed up to taking their fair share, rightly, of asylum seekers and vulnerable people, and embedding them and supporting them to lead healthy, happy lives in this country. What we need to make sure is that the systems and processes are put in place to adequately support local authorities to do that, and that the Home Office and the suppliers sort of live up to the expectations that rightly should be placed on them in terms of their engagement with us, and to provide the type of accommodation and support that those asylum seekers need. Francis.
Thanks. Colleagues, one of the areas I would want to focus on is that transparency and partnership work, and true transparency, so much more engaging conversations about what contracts need to look like going forward, that we are at the table and talking about our local plans, and to look about one of the things that's not in the contract just now is about skills and learning and giving people the opportunity to be active members of communities. So working with the Home Office to really build a community in the areas that we would then plan across, particularly in Scotland anyway, across all 32 local authorities, and obviously all 32 have signed up for that. So I think there's real opportunities to change the dialogue around asylum, and to make sure that there is a local plan that then builds on that regionally.
Thank you, Paul.
So I think for me there's a number of things. Obviously continuing the work that's already started around fairer distribution, to make sure every local authority in the country plays its part in what is a national emergency in many respects. I think we need a clear support offer for integration and prevention, and that should start from day one, and it shouldn't just be about handing someone a pack and accommodation. This is about being person-centric, it's about co-producing that, it's about really valuing lived experience and learning from engagement to reinforce how we deliver the contract and how we learn from that as that moves through. I think we have to think short-term about this and long-term, because I'm being really honest, I don't think we're going to address all of these issues overnight. Certainly the housing supply issues are going to take considerable time to actually address, years and years of failed housing policy in this country. I think good things have started around move on and homelessness, obviously with the 56 days we've already talked about. I think we need to learn from accelerated asylum and where we've gone wrong there, and how we can better improve that working relationship with combined authorities and local authorities. Data sharing, and I know colleagues have already touched on this, but that is a huge issue at the moment. It's sporadic. Sometimes we get reasonable engagement and then it falls off a cliff and we hear nothing. There needs to be consistency, and we need really good granular data here to properly strategically plan and to galvanise our partners, including the voluntary community, faith and social enterprise sector. And that needs to be individual level data as well as location specific. And we need to think about how we share that data with housing providers in the round, so implications for housing associations here, not just local government, implications potentially for the private rented sector as well, and what structures we all may or may not have in place in that space. Obviously, I say that at a time when Mayor Burnham is just about to introduce the Good Landlord Charter in Greater Manchester. We've got Awab's Law, we've got the Renters' Rights Bill going through government at the moment. We need some coherence there about how that interfaces ultimately with asylum and refugees. And then social services and health as well.
Can I ask you an explicit question? Should the responsibility move from providers to local authorities in a decentralised model? Should local authorities be responsible for providing?
I don't think we can simply say yes or no to that. I think, we've got to think short term, long term, but we've also got to think rationally and empirically and logically about this. To simply hand this contract to local government after 14 years of austerity, after councils have been hollowed out, after regulatory services in terms of housing standards don't really exist, and we're having to train the workforce for the future, I think would be absolute madness, to be perfectly honest with you. I do think we need to put people at the heart of all of this. It is not simply a matter of who provides the contract. This is about all of us actually rolling up our sleeves, getting stuck in to form a system that drives outcomes that benefit the people within that system.
Natasha.
Thank you. I absolutely fully endorse the comments made by previous panellists. But in addition to that, for me, a review of the standards in respect of accommodation and the arrangements for regulating those standards. It's not ideal that they sit outside of the regulatory framework, and there's a lack of influence and accountability for providers in that respect. So I would like to see some further review in respect of standards, both of contingency accommodation and dispersal accommodation. The Home Office, one would assume, has a significant wealth of information available to it in respect of the flow of activity over recent years, and we would welcome an improved demand and a supply forecasting model in respect of when to flex the model and stand up new accommodation and short-term sites. In addition, for the East region, incorporating the contingency asylum estate into the dispersal quota is a significant issue. There are a number of local authorities who are reported as significantly under plan and not achieving plan. However, when looking to include and incorporate the numbers for the contingency estate, some of those authorities would achieve plan and will be very close to plan. So we would welcome a review of that arrangement.
Peter, can I just put that final question to you as well? What's your view from an LGA perspective of local authorities taking over responsibility?
Yeah, look, changing the agent in the system isn't going to change the system. We need systemic change to housing in this country that ensures that we're delivering great quantities of genuinely affordable homes accessible for everybody, whether they are incredibly vulnerable, are asylum seekers, or currently stuck in temporary accommodation. 1 in 26 children in London currently is in temporary accommodation. That's 1 per class in every school in our city. Local authorities are doing their level best with the resources that they have available to them and the conversations and the input that they have with the Home Office and with providers to be able to do the duties that are expected of them in all those areas. I doubt simply asking local authorities to take over that responsibility will magic the supply of the quantum of homes that we need in this country.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. We have once again completed our time with you, and we still always have more questions that we would like to ask, but we realise that time is short. If there are any further points that you want the committee to hear, then please do feed them in to us. But can I thank you very much, all of you, for your time today and for your answers to our questions. And that concludes the session today. Order.